Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center for all of you who are here and for those of you who are online joining us. For those who I do not know, I'm Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and have the distinct pleasure of working with our health team under the leadership of Marilyn Serapini out here someplace. Today, we're releasing a very short report entitled Strengthening Regulatory Collaboration Between FDA and CMS, and the report can be found on our website going forward. Just a few comments, personal comments, before we turn it over to our guests here today. Personally, I think we all are aware that there is a critical mission that CMS and FDA play in our healthcare system. FDA is charged with ensuring pharmaceutical therapies meet strict standards for drugs as being safe and effective, and that biologics meet standards that are of safety, purity, and potency. On the other hand, the CMS and their responsibilities to manage the Medicare and Medicaid programs are charged with determining whether reimbursements for certain therapies are deemed reasonable and necessary. I want to be very clear up front that nothing in the BPC report today and any of the recommendations would change or modify those clearly defined missions of the two agencies. And now, while it is always an ongoing issue that I've dealt with over my career, and an always politically charged issue of the level of government regulations in the private sector, I don't think any of us would disagree that the question all Americans want to be sure that the drugs they ingest are safe and effective, and that the cost to the taxpayer in providing those drugs be reasonable and necessary. So the coordination of these two critical agencies and the decision-making processes that they go through is necessary not only for the public's physical health, but also for the country and taxpayers' fiscal health. As many of you, I think, will recall, the approval of the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm in 2021 was complex and brought into question the critical review processes that FDA went through in approving that particular drug. It was followed with an 18-month congressional investigation. So, building on the questions raised in that investigation more broadly, the report that we're releasing today asks a very simple question: how can the FDA and CMS align their regulatory processes while preserving the unique independent roles each play? Let me be clear. This may be a simple and short report, but this was a tough exercise. We engaged in conversations with a diverse group of stakeholders, from providers and patients to industry professionals, with individuals with experience at FDA and CMS, and the richness of the perspectives we received underscored the fact that everyone has a valuable idea on how we can engage in regulatory approval, in the regulatory approval process. From those conversations, BPC staff and working with the groups formulated 8 broad recommendations. Except for one recommendation that dealt with funding, the groups, all other of the recommendations do not require congressional approval. They're not flashy, they're not ostentatious. Instead, I believe they are simple, strict, and have practical applications and potential for hopefully positive change. I want to highlight just a couple that I think are important. The discussions that follows will get into more detail on some of the others. But the first recommendation, and this is probably the central recommendation of this report today, is to ensure that CMS has timely information available from FDA in a more formalized quarterly sharing of information, and that should be an established process going forward. This would include a listing of the products under consideration for accelerated approval and a listing of the new molecular entities to align with PDUFA. I think staff found that while this information sharing may be taking place on an informal basis, we concluded that a much more structural knowledge transfer basis was needed with less reliance on individual initiatives within the two agencies. Number two, real-world evidence. BPC, as some of the staff here know, launched about 3 or 4 years ago a project that we called evidence-based policymaking. And I am proud to say that in part because of that initiative, Congress enacted the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. This report, in many ways, doubles down on the Evidence Act and asked ARC, the lead federal agency for research and quality, to annually compile, organize, and analyze real-world evidence obtained by CMS on drugs and biologics, and that it be then shared with the FDA and drug product sponsors. And while we understand this may be in part happening today through the Sentinel initiative, this evidence collected would go beyond the scope of what Sentinel collects today. Number three, accelerated approval. This is an important recommendation. We would ask that CMS be allowed to engage with product sponsors of accelerated approval drugs before FDA brings them to market authorization. BPC believes having CMS officials participating and observing meetings between FDA and the drug sponsors would allow CMS and FDA, along with the product developer, early in the process to determine important knowledge gaps and goals for post-market studies and for CMS to be better able to look at the life cycle of the product. Finally, as I mentioned, there was only one recommendation here that had to do with funding, congressional action, and that is we do acknowledge that some of these recommendations, as well as the fact that the resources are needed today, that there would be a request for additional funding. And this should be targeted to CMS to increase its staffing that might be required to carry out some of the recommendations we're talking about. Overall, these recommendations, of course, aim to create a more efficient, informed, collaborative healthcare system that adapts to the ever-evolving and fast-evolving landscape of drug development, approval, and utilization. In closing, as I said, this was not an easy report to find consensus around. I want to thank the BPC staff, many of them here today, who worked on this project. Katie Adams back here, Shanna Christop, Brady Newell, Aidan Kennedy, our consultants Kara Tenenbaum, Amy Barasno, Remy Brim, Brent Del Monte, also our BPC Health Care advisors, Sheila Burke, Jim Capretta, and Chris Jennings, and Dr. Lee Fleischer, who you'll hear from shortly. During today's event, we'll have a panel of experts here talk about these issues in more detail. But first, a fireside chat without the far side with Dr. Wilson Bryan, who recently left FDA after a 19-year career there, culminating in his leadership of FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and now is at Greenleaf Health. And Dr. Lee Fleischer, which I mentioned until last year, was CMS Chief Medical Officer and Director, now at the University of Penn Medicine, and most importantly, as I said, a Senior Health Advisor here at BPC. Thank you. This discussion will be led by an award-winning journalist, Joyce Friedman, Washington editor of MedPage Today. So, Joyce, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Welcome, everybody. I'm Joyce Frieden from MedPage Today, and I want to give a warm welcome to both our in-person audience and our online audience. And a special word to the folks online. We are taking your questions. We would love to hear from you. You can put questions onto Twitter, or X, I guess, as the kids call it, at hashtag BPC Live, or in the chat on the YouTube channel. So we will get right into it now. We have great speakers, so I want to introduce, again, the the folks for the fireside chat. To my immediate left, Dr. Lee Fleischer, who is an emeritus professor of anesthesiology and critical care at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a former chief medical officer at CMS from 2020 to 2023, and he's a healthcare leader with expertise in patient care, healthcare innovation, AI, and regulatory oversight. And as a senior advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center, he continues to shape healthcare policy while teaching at the UPenn Masters in Healthcare Innovation program. I'll have to ask you about that. That sounds interesting. Focusing on advancing quality and value in healthcare. And then to his left, we have Dr. Wilson Bryan. Dr. Bryan is a neurologist and former FDA leader. He joined Greenleaf Health in 2023 after a 19-year career at FDA. His FDA journey included leading the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies and overseeing the regulation of gene and cellular therapies, which, of course, very hot topic these days. With expertise in neuromuscular disorders, clinical trials, and transformative FDA regulation, he brings valuable insights from both the regulatory and clinical perspectives. So to start off, I think it would be helpful to get perspective from both of you who have seen the interactions or lack thereof between FDA and CMS. So can you start, Dr. Fleischer, by telling me about your interactions with the other agency while you were there?
Well, in fact, it was quite positive in many ways, but there are, as Bill sort of mentioned, opportunities for improvement. But in the most positive way, for anything we dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, the minute I came in and Peter Marks overseeing the vaccines, it was really an all-of-government discussion. I could call, text, ask him what is happening, talk to my CDC colleagues, and actually be able to understand what's going to, in the next few days, when they're going to approve the vaccine, so we could be prepared, both in the area that I oversaw, the nursing homes in particular, but in general coverage decisions. When MPOX was occurring, had multiple discussions. In fact, Tim Stencil and Jeff Shuren in the device side, we would have weekly meetings for almost the entire time I was in the government regarding diagnostics and how to think about both. We were prepared when MPOX occurred, but the COVID-19 diagnostics. Mm-hmm. So that was a larger group. It wasn't just CMS, but CDC and BARDA and RADx were there, and the NIH was there. But that all of government was there. I think on the device side, there's a long history of conversations. I think on the drug side, most drugs are approved by the MACs, by the Medicare Administrative Contractors. So CMS rarely has discussions on drugs, except for, as Bill mentioned, the Alzheimer's drugs, the monoclonals. So that really was a new sojourn as we made the decision to go forward and open that national coverage analysis and then decision. And really, the ability to understand what are the MOUs, to talk between the agencies, how much the pharma could come in and talk to us about their drug, because the coverage and analysis group frequently meets with them. I think that's where it really was a new opportunity to converse.
Okay. And Dr. Bryan, what was your experience?
So I was director of the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies in the Center for Biologics, and we regulated cell therapies and gene therapies. And my interaction with CMS was actually only a few times a year. And what would happen would CMS would contact us about a particular label for a product, such as a CAR T product for a hematologic malignancy, and they say, okay, we've got this indication statement, and we see the evidence that's described in the reviews and the label, and it's not quite clear. there's some ambiguity there about which patients are actually getting benefit from this product. And I was always impressed with how carefully they looked at our language and thought that maybe some communication earlier in the process would have been helpful to us as we wrote those labels. So when CMS would reach out to us, we would always check to see if the communications were covered under the MOU, and they always were. And we always gave, the folks at the FDA are very busy, but we always gave priority to CMS because that's a question of access for patients. And it was very collaborative, I felt.
Can you talk more for people who may not be familiar with it, either of you, about the MOU, how long it's been around, what it says?
I don't know how long. It's a memorandum of understanding, and we frequently have this throughout government. It's interesting about data sharing, but it's the ability to really have agencies tell each other sort of what's behind the curtain. But I don't know.
Right. So the FDA has access to a lot of confidential information, and the FDA's ability to function
I'll do that later in the conversation.
depends on having that relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, that they know that the information that they've given to us is confidential. And so there need to be some strict rules about what can be shared with other agencies and other. And so that MOU is important to have in place to be sure that we're not sharing something that shouldn't be shared without the consent of the pharmaceutical industry, and to be sure that the folks on the other side, that CMS understands what's confidential and keeps the information confidential.
Okay.
And if I may, you actually mentioned about the label, and I think, at least what I learned, and you may, is that's one of the most important things from a reasonable and necessary statutory question of, what is the label and have they studied enough Medicare patients in a diverse population? Because it's reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of a disease or injury, and we always add in the Medicare population, which is our insured population. So the label frequently isn't known until I'd love to hear.
This is important because the label is worked out between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry, often late in the review cycle. They try to move it earlier and earlier, but workload issues, it's often very late that the label gets worked out. And that's done with those two parties. And it's not done with someone external looking at it and saying, okay, what you folks are working out, it doesn't make sense to us. And sometimes I think CMS would look at the label and say, it's not quite clear. There's some ambiguity there. And if someone would look at that negotiation earlier, maybe we could have done a better job.
Very interesting. One of the things that Bill mentioned in his introduction was the quarterly meetings. He talked about formalizing them, but I understand that the leadership does have these informally right now. So, Dr. Fleischer, I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that really, my understanding was it occurred prior to the pandemic. It took a little while, to be honest. There was, leadership changes and the appointment of the commissioner. But once the commissioner was there, Rob Califf, those began again. They are jointly by the chiefs of staff, decide on the agenda. I was there at all of them. They were frequently in person as soon as we could go back in person, since the government, for a while it was not in person.
Right.
But importantly, the coverage and analysis group, so not only the chief medical officer, but the leadership of the other key centers were invited. The leadership of my coverage group, my previous coverage group was invited, did it. And we brought, if, for example, the topic was sickle cell, which I can tell you was on the topic, we would bring the right people into the room to have those discussions. So great idea. Hopefully it's more that it can continue at that level.
Do you feel like it percolated down? Whatever happened?
I can tell you on the CMS side, we frequently had conversations. Many people may be familiar with the transitional coverage of emerging technologies program that I had the privilege of pushing out, I think just a couple months before I left. And that program was on the agenda. And the ability for Tamara Sirek-Jensen, who was the coverage group director at the time, myself, Jeff Shuren, to have further conversations in the room did occur. So I think that's important that continues.
The report obviously talked about how the organizations can work better together. You've mentioned to me the issue of the statutory authorities of each agency. Can you talk about that and how those two?
Yeah, no, I'll start with reasonable and necessary, and I just defined it, that idea of reasonable and necessary. We are, quote, an insurer, but a public insurer, CMS is a public insurer, reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis and treatment of a disease or injury in a population. So it's particularly most of the accelerated approvals, and I know we'll get to that, cancer, et cetera, HIV, are well-established surrogates. It happened on the Alzheimer's. It was a new surrogate. I'm happy to address that later. But the other question is, and this happens all the time on the device side, are there enough patients in the Medicare population that me as a clinician, that the patients, most importantly, and their families, because frequently, particularly in the older population, it includes their families, have enough information to be able to make informed decisions on their care and should they take these drugs or devices. And on the device side, we've always had coverage with evidence development, which is this idea of giving people access, even if there's insufficient information to say it truly is a treatment for a disease, give them access, but collecting data so that the patients can make the decision, as well as long-term whether or not CMS should cover that. So I think, and as well as the diversity of the population, which I know has become important for both CMS and FDA in their new guidances. So, as CMS looks at it, I think those are the critical questions, and it became important when this new surrogate and accelerated approval occurred for the Alzheimer drug.
I'm curious, does CMS actually make an assessment of effectiveness or of benefit? Do they make that assessment, or is it just about getting the information so that someone else can make that assessment?
So I guess we're going to go there quickly. So we might as well. So, the interesting thing about with Alzheimer's, and if you look at the decision, it was a two-part decision. Number one is it said for accelerated approval that the surrogate, was that surrogate enough to meet the threshold of treatment of a disease or injury, because it was a new surrogate, and that was the decision for a clinical trial. If you looked, as soon as a drug was approved by FDA, and FDA made the decision that it actually was effective in the treatment of disease, and that's the traditional approval, CMS said it is covered, full access, although for this particular drug, at the time, I and then the administrator felt it was important to collect continued data, but there was full access to the drug. So it's really leaning in on the sister agency to say when FDA makes that determination.
Had CMS done this before with other drugs? You mentioned it had been done with devices.
Done all yeah.
Had it been done before with drugs, or was this the first time?
CAR T, it was proposed, as you may remember, since you were there, of doing a national coverage. But most coverage decisions really are done by the Medicare advisory, Medicare administrative contractors. So most are done really, and that may be good or bad, by one of the 13. So it gives almost like the states it could happen in a non-uniform way. And that was one of the questions, because there was a lot of questions of would this be done uniformly by all the MACs for the Alzheimer's drugs. The second thing that I've made clear in previous writings and talks is CMS, to my knowledge, has never questioned reduction in tumor burden, reduction in CD4 counts. HIV and cancer for the traditional accelerated approval surrogates had always been accepted. So it really was this new surrogate that there was a lot of controversy when we opened the national coverage analysis.
And we're probably going to see a lot more surrogates.
Which is one of the recommendations in the, yes.
That particularly in the world of gene therapy, the Center for Biologics has indicated that they think that we're going to need more surrogates in these very rare diseases. And we're at a wonderful time in gene therapy and science. The science has advanced where we have technology now to treat some very bad diseases but some of these diseases are extremely rare. And we're going to probably need surrogate endpoints to get these through development. And they're going to be novel surrogates in most cases.
I think that's what, in the report, it really talked about the need for sort of the scientific community. And I think, we talk about the coverage and analysis group. It is about 40 people. So and there are 43 physicians. And when you talk about the science, which is why CMS so heavily relies on our colleagues at the FDA. But, I will be transparent. There was a lot of controversy about is the reduction in amyloid. If you talk to the NIH, and we did at CMS, and when it got a large number of comments. So the hope is that any future surrogates, the scientific community, like if you have an adequate gene level, and I've heard Peter Marks talk about this, if you do a CRISPR or any kind of gene editing, you create the gene, and I'd be curious, and it produces sufficient protein to say it should have an effect. It's in the pathway of the disease. That should be sufficient.
Well, that gets to the question of what is a sufficient effect. And these surrogates, you may remember the approval of the exon skipping drug for Duchenne dystrophy. Mm-hmm. And the issue of how much of a change really matters. Does any change matter? Mm-hmm. And with these rare diseases, in most cases, we probably won't have the data to know how much of a change really matters. We'll see change in the surrogate, and we say, well, that's a surrogate that matters. Does that amount of change matter? And we'll probably be short on the data. And we'll have to find a way to deal with that.
So the question is, and I've heard the commissioner talk about this, if we're going to go upstream and we're going to approve earlier, what are the authorities of both FDA and CMS and Medicaid, state agencies, can really use? Because, as someone who still practices, and patients want to know, does it work? And particularly for gene therapy, you got one shot. Right. You can't give them multiple genes. So the sooner we know this is the one or this isn't the one, so what's that evidence collection? I think that's a key point that FDA and CMS can work together. And I think there's some in the report, I think it doesn't explicitly call that out, but I think that's some of the background of having these discussions.
Well, can I needle you a little about that? What made you decide we're not going to do totally full coverage? We're going to do coverage with an asterisk that you need to be in. What was it? What tipped you?
When and it really was the team. We have epidemiologists. We talked to the FDA and continue to talk to the FDA. The final label on lecanemab was interesting because the FDA actually made a decision on lecanemab to include further studies. Mm-hmm. If you look at that, that wasn't the original label on aducanumab, which is all we had at the time. But it was really talking to the NIH, to practitioners in the field, and saying, is there sufficient data to know things like what happens in a more diverse population? What happens in patients with more comorbidities? And in particular, there's a lot of questions about access. And as someone who has the privilege of practicing in major academic medical centers, and having talked to it was a very interesting group at Emory. They went out and they actually worked within their state. They got a grant and they worked with 5 rural sites or 6 rural sites. And they did telehealth and they were able to provide the right setting, even if it was diverse. And with the data set, and I did stay in the agency an extra couple weeks to put out that data set, the agency will be able, or the academics, because they'll be part of the data set, to say, are there certain settings and certain combinations of patients and providers in which this is higher risk? And patients deserve to know that.
Okay.
Is it worth traveling? And if it's not, that's even better.
Right. Okay. Well, this sort of brings me into the whole topic of information asymmetry and how much is known by each agency. And, the Bipartisan Policy Center, they had a preliminary recommendation that a CMS official be included as a non-voting member on an FDA advisory panel. But the recommendation didn't go very well. And the thinking seems to be that the processes should remain pretty separate, how CMS and FDA deciding the approvals and the coverage. But drug sponsors seem to want more cooperation between the two. So I'd like to know your thoughts on keeping things separate versus.
I'll start. I'm in favor of keeping things separate. I think that there needs to be a system of checks and balances. And I think that there are folks who, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, who would like to have one decision from that sort of puts something on the market and gets it paid for. But I think that the checks and balances of having both agencies do their job independently is important to ensure that patients get a product and that taxpayers are paying for something that actually works, that benefits patients. And so I favor that. And I don't want to, what I'd like to see, and what I think the BPC is promoting, is better communication, and that CMS has access to the information that they need to make their decisions more expeditiously, perhaps, and that FDA can share the information that they have. That doesn't mean that they come to the same position on, for example, a surrogate endpoint, but that they both have access to all the information.
I'm glad I let you answer first because I'm fascinated by your answer. CMS is always going to defer to the FDA on safe and effective, but safe and effective for the indication that the pharmaceutical industry or device industry brings to the agency. This is what I've heard the commissioner say. So it's the indication they're bringing forward with the population they're bringing forward. And CMS, when I was there, and I don't think that will change, is going to not question that safe and effective. It's going to ask, does it reasonable and necessary, but in the Medicare population? So I think, CMS, when I was there, was always willing to meet with pharma. And I think what the decision that was made over the monoclonals is you should be studying it in the Medicare population too. If you're going to get it paid for, then it should, if you want an indication for 18 to 65,
Right.
is that relevant, except for a very small population, of course, to the Medicare population. But if you also want the federal government to pay for it, it would be great if the label and the studies were broad enough to say there's sufficient Medicare patients in that population. I'm not sure we're saying anything different, but
I think we're talking about different parts of the same question. And you get to the question of feasibility of clinical trials. And clinical trials are very imperfect at predicting whether a product is truly going to be beneficial when it's on the market. And of course, that's because that's perhaps even more true with the Medicare population because they are often neglected in the studies. But there is, as we've talked about, an interest in more diversity in clinical trials that hasn't focused as much, perhaps, as we should on the older patients.
And I did mention the 40 people. That is a real thing. How many people were in your center?
The center has, I think, about 1,200.
1,200. So it really, I don't think CMS needs to be at every advisory committee. I don't think, and I think that was one of the things that the BPC recognized. It's really when there are critical issues, and I will tell you, CMS did listen in, as part of the public. We didn't participate, but we got to hear the robust discussion. I don't think that another federal agency should interfere with the process, but really be.
Well, what about the notion of like sitting in on meetings with the drug sponsor?
I actually think it would be much more valuable to CMS to sit in on the internal meetings that the FDA has rather than the meetings with the sponsor. To hear the discussion internally within the FDA would be more valuable. But again, only a small number of these approvals have anything that's controversial or difficult about them. And, Aduhelm is very much a rare event.
Yeah.
And so you've got a small capacity at CMS. You can't be sitting in on every meeting for everything that's going into accelerated approval. And so we have to figure out how to use these resources most efficiently.
Okay, so our time is winding down. We have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to ask you each about kind of your long-term vision. Like if you were looking at this 5 years from now, how would you like to see the communications changed? Or
well, I think the first thing that I'd like to see happen is for FDA to understand what information does CMS need? Because I think FDA could, without being too burdensome, put in processes to gather that information during drug development, and CMS wouldn't have to be there every minute. But at the end of the day, drug development would gather the information that CMS needs. But that depends on FDA understanding what CMS needs.
It's interesting, and I'll actually expand upon that. Because CMS is much more of a black box to most people than FDA is.
Right.
And there is an innovator's handbook that I will tell you was created several years before I got there. And when I left, it still wasn't updated. So I think it's not only to FDA what CMS believes are the critical things. I think industry needs to listen. That if the goal, and then FDA and CMS need to work together to say, if you really want to do the right things for patients who are over 65 with multimorbidities, include them in your trials, either before or after. CMS will make those decisions. And if you do it earlier, then together there really is an evidence plan that CMS and FDA would work together to do, because I know that FDA uses the CMS claims all the time. And if you actually look at, I'll just say for the decision, the final registry that CMS created is 10 data elements. It took, I and my senior advisor on data strategy, we developed it with the team It takes 7 minutes to enter. It's all in the medical record. Hopefully one day it'll be FHIR-based. And the idea is you combine a little bit of EHR or clinical data with claims, and that can be so powerful for FDA to look for sentinel events.
Well, you guys are perfect. You have finished exactly on time, so I want to thank you both so much. And we'll welcome up our next panel.
Right.
Either way, it's fine. Okay. So now we've heard a lot about the Medicare side of things, and we are going to transition into talking about Medicaid and how the Medicaid side of CMS can better interact with FDA. So for this, we have two terrific speakers. To my immediate left is Jack Rollins. He joined the National Association of State Medicaid Directors in 2014, and your title is
Director of Federal Policy.
Director of Federal Policy. He brings valuable expertise in Medicaid prescription drug coverage, managed care, and long-term services and supports. We had an interesting discussion about long-term care, which is a whole nother topic. His background includes internships at a safety net hospital association, a healthcare lobbying firm, and policy work for a nonprofit organization of women state legislators. Jack holds an MPH in health policy from George Washington University and a BA in philosophy and government from the College of William and Mary. And to his left is Dr. Remy Brim Mason, a healthcare policy expert and principal at BGR, where she specializes in FDA-regulated products. As co-head of BGR's healthcare practice, she provides strategic policy and advocacy support. Remy was formerly a senior FDA policy advisor to the Senate Health Committee's ranking member, Senator Patty Murray of Washington. And in that role, she was lead negotiator and advisor for U.S. Senate Democrats on FDA medical devices, prescription drugs, biologics, food safety, and cosmetic policy initiatives. Boy, never a dull moment there, including the 21st Century Cures Act and the FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017. Remy has a BS in microbiology and molecular genetics and a PhD in pharmacology. So she combines technical expertise with a commitment to sound public health policy. So I wanted to start out by talking about a little bit about how Medicaid works. We just heard in the previous panel about Medicare's reasonable and necessary framework for figuring out whether it's going to cover a particular drug or treatment. So Jack, I was wondering if you could discuss what the regulatory standard is for Medicaid coverage and how does that maybe make it a little more complicated to administer the Medicaid program?
Sure. So I think first I'd like to do a little stage setting about Medicaid because it is quite a distinct and diverse program compared to Medicare. Medicaid is a jointly financed federal and state program. It's kind of states do contribute some of their own state dollars to the administration of the Medicaid program, receiving federal match on those dollars. CMS is the primary regulator of the Medicaid program, creates the broad parameters under which states actively administer the program. So it is very much a program that embodies the spirit of federalism. States have significant leeway in how they structure and kind of design and operate their Medicaid programs. Another thing to note, and that is really relevant for this conversation, is that prescription drug coverage is technically under Medicaid statute an optional benefit rather than a mandatory one. That being said, every state does cover prescription drugs. There are, for reference, 56 Medicaid programs, the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 U.S. territories. The territories do not currently participate in the Medicare drug rebate program, which I'm going to talk about because it is directly relevant to answering your question, Joyce. So within that framework, the prescription drug benefit in Medicaid while optional, is something that every state does cover, but it does so through the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, or MDRP. I will try to limit the use of jargon, but MDRP is just a quicker way to say what I'm trying to talk about, so I'm going to be saying that going forward. The MDRP is a unique program because it creates unique coverage obligations under Medicaid compared to other payers, in that in exchange for receiving mandatory rebates off of list prices for covered outpatient drugs, which can include physician-administered drugs, Medicaid is obligated to cover any product, any therapy, any drug that is approved by the FDA. And that is an FDA-approved indications and usage. That is the statutory coverage obligation that Medicaid operates under. So that is a pretty distinct obligation compared to Medicare's reasonable and necessary framework. It's also quite distinct from private payers who have discretion to cover or not cover given products and may choose to do so for a variety of reasons. Within that framework, however, Medicaid, in addition to receiving mandatory rebates off of list price, and it's a 23% rebate roughly for a brand drug, around 19% for a generic, so there's a little bit of differentiation there. Medicaid also receives mandatory inflation rebates, so if a drug's price increases year over year, outpacing medical inflation, Medicaid receives a mandatory rebate to bring that price back down to the inflation level. Medicaid also gets what's called the best price rebate, where if a manufacturer negotiates a price that is kind of below what Medicaid would receive under those rebate obligations, generally with a commercial or private payer, most federal payers are exempt from this, Medicaid would receive that best price. That's an important piece of context for later in our conversation when we probably get into value-based purchasing arrangements and value-based agreements. So, big picture, Medicaid has a distinct set of coverage obligations that are kind of tied to FDA approval of products, but Medicaid also does have the ability to apply utilization management and prior authorization criteria similar to what many other insurers are able to do when they do cover products. So while Medicaid does have a coverage obligation, there can be prior authorization and other criteria that need to be met before access will necessarily be achieved for a given product.
Okay. All right. Remy, anything you want to add about where you see Medicaid's coverage impacts?
Sure. I'll just add, we talked a lot about the diversity of trials with ages, over 65 for the Medicare population. Medicaid population, as Jack well knows, is very different. The Medicaid population is heavily young. The vast majority of births in this country are covered by Medicaid, and most folks with rare diseases are covered by Medicaid. And so especially when we're thinking about cell and gene therapies coming to market, when we're thinking about kids with rare diseases, burdens on families, things like the sickle cell drugs that were approved in December, Medicaid is that primary payer. And so when we sort of see these debates, Aduhelm was obviously meant for an over 65 population. Some of the sickle products would be in a younger population, heavily Medicaid. And so when we see these debates coming up about government payers, it generally has to do with what population those folks are covering, which is very distinct.
And one of the report from BPC's recommendations talks about the idea of having the FDA provide additional education to Medicaid officials regarding the FDA's processes. So I was wondering, Jack, whether you think there are knowledge gaps that the FDA could help close.
Sure, and I thought that the conversation around kind of the labeling process and how late that the labeling conversation enters into the FDA approval process, I think is probably one of the best areas for additional insight that can be shared with Medicaid's decision makers. Probably not directly with Medicaid directors themselves. Medicaid directors often don't come from clinical backgrounds and have very busy jobs, but they are very reliant on their clinical teams, medical directors and pharmacy administrators. Each of them have their own sort of national associations that would be, I think, excellent vehicles for more routine communication with FDA. So like the Medicaid Medical Directors Network, for example, who are actually supported by Academy Health here in DC. And there are a number of regional pharmacy administrator associations that really self-organize and self-actualize But those are, I think, places where there are great opportunities for having some of these conversations to help those folks who will in turn be involved with some of the processes at the state level through state pharmacy and therapeutics committees or drug utilization review boards, who play a more formal role in helping to inform and set some of those coverage criteria and prior authorization criteria that ultimately kind of dictate what access looks like in the Medicaid program. So I think that labeling issue, to my mind, is probably one of the first and foremost things that I think could provide more insight, especially as that is kind of directly links to the statutory coverage obligation under the Medicaid drug rebate program.
How often do you think that would need to be done? You and I were discussing kind of some of the turnover issues in some of the state Medicaid programs.
So I think quarterly would be great if that could be possible. And I'm speaking out of turn because I do not know the specific cadence with which the Medicaid medical directors networks and the pharmacy folks have their conversations. But I do think a more frequent and formalized exchange of information, just like what we heard in the conversation right before ours, between FDA and CMS, being able to take that kind of formalized structure and a regular and routine cadence that kind of is pushed out to those networks of Medicaid clinical leaders and decision makers, I think would be immensely valuable.
And Remy, are there gaps that you see in this?
Well, I want to build on the point about the labels, because we talked about the labels in the first panel as well. Just sort of as table setting, the FDA label is something that is negotiated between the product sponsor and the agency. That negotiation to figure out that final label actually happens very late in the drug approval process, sort of right before approval. FDA operates on a timeline after the product application is submitted, so after the clinical trials are completed, they bundle that up in an application, submit it to FDA. If it's a priority application, FDA aims to do that within 8 months, 10 months for a standard review. And so when you get down to those last months, maybe weeks of a negotiation, that's when those label conversations really start to happen. And so when we think about how can we be more deliberate with these labels, I think it is time for the industry and FDA to come together and start thinking about, should we be having these conversations earlier? Of course, you have to review the whole data package before you get to those label conversations, but it's very difficult to make sure things are going through all different sides of your company, being able to talk to your market access folks to make sure, does this make sense to them? Is this using a word where in the regulatory land, we think about that just sort of as a scientific way to explain the product, but maybe it triggers something else in the minds of payers that could be really detrimental. And you don't have time to do that when you're sort of shoved up against your PDUFA date.
Yeah.
And so being able to be more deliberate and draw those timelines back in those label conversations, I think will even give sponsors time to be able to have the conversations, to do the socialization, to talk to market access, to make sure that label is representative, because it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue for patient access when you have payers sort of combing through the label. When we think about a label, it's actually, if you print it out, some of these are 20 pages long.
I was just going to ask if they can shorten that.
Yeah. Because the label was always intended to be a communication to healthcare professionals. It's not a patient communication vehicle. It's not a payer communication vehicle. It was meant and designed to be a way to communicate to physicians. But it's now being used by payers, and I think we have to be realistic about that at this point. And so, yes, we want to make sure we have all the scientific data in there, but when that data is being picked apart by a payer or insurance that, oh, well, your clinical trial population only included a 3-year-old, but didn't include a 2.5-year-old, so we're not going to cover your 2.5-year-old until they progress in their disease 6 more months. I mean, that's the type of thing that we're seeing in the market, and where I think some of this education about how FDA extrapolates clinical trial, the clinical trial population to actually make an indication that is broader than that population, so that patients aren't being sort of unduly withheld based on misinterpretations about what a clinical trial population means.
Okay. All right, now moving on from the label issue, another facet of this whole relationship is something that we also talked a little bit about in the last panel, the accelerated approvals. And, just to table set there, those are the ones granted, to remind people, those are the ones granted by FDA for drugs for which there's an unmet need and for which there's a surrogate endpoint, which we were talking about earlier, that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. So I wanted you guys to just talk about what's the value of this accelerated approval program and whether it's been successful in meeting unmet needs in Medicaid patients and, you know, how it complicates things for Medicaid.
I'll let you take
Yeah,
that one
I'll
first.
start with at least the FDA perspective. I think also for table setting, accelerated approval, we've been hearing a lot more in the sort of popular healthcare press, but this started back during the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. There was a huge outcry from the patient community, frustrated with FDA for not approving products for patients who had no other options, who were dying. And FDA at the time was very much waiting to see, okay, we need a placebo-controlled trial, and we need to see that this product shows that there is some sort of benefit on mortality, and the folks who get placebo, well, I guess they're going to die, and we need to have the perfect data. And if there was huge protests at NIH. I'm being a little colloquial, but there was huge there was protests at NIH, there was protests at FDA. And eventually they got to, FDA said, okay, we can approve these products based on a surrogate. We can say, okay, if we look at CD4 counts, if we look at reduction in viral load, it would be reasonable to assume that that is going to make life better for those patients. We don't know it yet, but let's at least give them access to those. And that's where sort of accelerated approval came from. And so it's important to sort of remember that history as we're going through this. It was officially codified in 2012. But since that time, a lot of the focus of accelerated approval has been on these cancer therapies, third line, fourth line, fifth line cancer therapies in very sick patients. And no one really batted an eye, mostly when that was happening. I think we all, everyone knows someone with cancer. Everyone sort of understands, okay, if I can eke out 3 more months to get to my daughter's wedding, or I can, see my grandchild be born, that's important. Just that little bit, that's important. And I think we understood that in cancer, and the payers paid for the products, and sort of no one batted an eye. I think where we started to see a shift in that, and obviously Aljahelm was the big thing that everyone started to learn about. However, we've also been seeing this in the rare disease community as well, that there is a pushback to these products that have been coming through with accelerated approval to say, oh, well, are we completely sure that making this much dystrophin is going to do something when it could be this much dystrophin? Is it okay? Well, is plaque the best marker? We don't know, and I think those are the things that accelerated approval is for. That was the whole intent of the pathway to start with, and so to sort of look at it sort of askew now and say, oh, well, now it's being used in rare diseases, and now it's being used in things that can treat the Medicare population, and just a slight benefit to a family to hold off Alzheimer's so they can go to the wedding, or have your child walk. I mean, these are for some reason, it's not getting the same benefit that cancer has gotten. And I understand that some of that is a payer issue. But I think that the challenge to the program is really detrimental to sort of why we're all here, why these drug makers are in the market, why we are here to sort of deliver things to patients. Because if we are going to wait for the perfect thing, science is only getting harder. If we're waiting for the perfect thing and the perfect data, we're never going to get that. It's going to be a nuanced conversation. And so I personally feel very passionately about the pathway and its benefit to patients, the benefit to the industry, to keep science going. And FDA has tools to pull these products off the market if they don't work. And that's what Congress did in the last user fee reauthorization. In 2022, they gave FDA some more tools to make it easier to get those products that don't work off the market. But it's so important that patients have that opportunity.
I'm going to have a slightly different perspective. So the important thing and I don't disagree at all with the importance of what the accelerated approval pathway has meant in terms of options to treat things that were previously untreatable, or to explore much better ways to treat things where we've only been able to just manage symptoms and not really have someone have a good quality of life. Like that really is the overall goal. And there's been incredible innovation in the clinical space as a result of this pathway. I think that is a good thing. The challenge comes in sustainable access to those therapies. And in Medicaid, as I noted earlier, a jointly financed state and federal program, states operate balanced budgets in every budget cycle that they have, whether it's on an annual or biannual basis. Medicaid is one of the top 3 line items in any state's budget cycle. It's Medicaid, it's education, it's infrastructure, typically speaking. And that creates real challenging conversations and trade-offs at the state policymaking level. What is difficult for Medicaid is because of those coverage obligations that we have, and to be fair, some of these things may end up being bundled in a kind of a hospital payment where there's a different way of financing. But there is a sustainability question around, especially as we look to the future, where we see more and more reliance on surrogate endpoints and more innovation here in the clinical space. The financing innovation is not yet keeping pace, especially in the Medicaid world. Medicaid is not designed to be able to absorb upfront costs for treatments that there can be a question of their efficacy that is yet to be answered and will be answered as we do at sort of real world evidence development basis. In the perfect world, we get there, everything does work, it's money well spent. But when that doesn't happen, and this is why it's important that we get into a conversation around value-based arrangements, Medicaid is not going to be able to sustain upfront costs, like to look at the sickle cell therapy examples. Those are $2 or $3 million treatments. Even with a 23% discount on list price, that's still a significant investment of state dollars. No doubt that if they work, and if we can cure a child living with sickle cell, that child is going to live a much healthier and longer life. And that is what we need to incentivize in our payment structures, to not have the financing be a barrier to that. Right now, as a practical matter, it is.
Yeah.
So these are the real decisions that Medicaid directors and their teams have to grapple with. Is we don't have the luxury of an open-ended budget. Like, we have to make difficult decisions, difficult trade-offs. If we cover this product to the fullest extent that we can, what else is giving way in our program? Whether it's within the pharmacy budget or other places of Medicaid. Is that a home and community-based services waiver program that we now have to cap more aggressively than we are today, or cap when we don't today? Like, those are real-world trade-offs in the Medicaid policymaking environment. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind, and why it's so important to have these better lines of insight into how FDA approval processes work, how the trials are extrapolated, what that decision-making actually looks like, so that Medicaid can make appropriate decisions that kind of navigate those trade-offs in a way that, recognizing not everyone is going to be happy. I think that we're not going to solve these access challenges overnight, but we can get to a better place than we are today.
Okay, well, I have a follow-up, but again, I want to encourage people to start thinking of questions. I know you all probably have better questions than I do. And the folks online, again, put them in the chat or hashtag BPC Live. I wanted to follow up on what you were saying. Can you talk more about where value-based arrangements fit into Medicaid and what's happening now?
Sure.
With them?
So in value-based arrangements, when we're talking about, especially in this kind of Medicaid drug rebate program world of covered outpatient drugs, primarily exist in what's called like the supplemental rebate space, where there's essentially, think of it as like layers of rebates. There's the mandatory ones that Medicaid is entitled to or receives under the MDRP, but states can negotiate with manufacturers for additional rebates on top of that. It's most commonly been in in a sort of preferred drug list environment, kind of having multiple products that are generally equivalent or can treat the same condition, and the state can try to say, like, you'll get your market share manufacturer if you give us a supplemental rebate. We'll prefer your product over your competitors. That's not really going to be a perfect model in this CGT environment. We're talking about products that are going to be highly specialized, only treating maybe a few hundred people nationwide.
CGT.
Cell and gene therapies.
Cell and gene therapies.
These are if we're targeting very rare conditions, it's unlikely we're going to be seeing a lot of competition in the space, at least in the short term. So that's why we have to think about a different structure. And that's where we can think about this outcomes-based arrangement. Now, there is a potential barrier with the Medicaid best price, right? And that's something that CMS has actually tried to address through rulemaking, where they've created a regulatory structure that would allow multiple best prices if certain best prices are attained through a value-based agreement that might be conditioned on outcomes. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into this. There's not a lot of them that are currently active in Medicaid, probably 20-ish. My numbers might not be quite right, but it's the direction that I think we have to go in, especially for the products that we're talking about today. Because Medicaid needs that confidence that if a product ends up not working over a defined time span, there is some ability to recapture some of the upfront investment that might have gone into that. Otherwise, we run into that sustainability issue that I was talking about earlier. And so a lot of this is likely going to be sitting in that additional negotiation space, kind of like the MDRP is the fallback. Medicaid can have confidence that you're at least going to get that 23% rebate, for example. But it's probably going to take more than that to really achieve our access goals. What is challenging is kind of the administrative complexity that can go alongside these agreements. I think that these models are still quite nascent. We're talking, and we have to solve for, especially if there is, say, a child receiving a treatment in Medicaid who may not be on Medicaid certainly not for their entire lives, we would hope. But value is accrued over the course of a lifespan. We don't have a good way to account for that. So we can think about amortization models, payment over time models, outcome-based models. All of it needs to also address real-world data collection and analysis and infrastructure. Not every state is really going to be equipped to do that, so that's why it's very exciting that CMMI is stepping into this space.
Oh, I was going to get there.
I know.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. I think industry's all in on sort of trying to move to value-based agreements. A lot of other areas of healthcare are already trying to move this way, especially in the physician community. But I think the CGT sort of influx that's coming is going to be sort of what tips it in the drug space. I think Medicaid best price rule could start. I think there's still some uncertainties with regards to, rules can always be rescinded by different administrations. So trying to codify some of those pieces, dealing with ASP and AMP reporting as well. And so there's, bills in Congress like the MVP Act, which I think, folks are excited about to try to move that across the line, give companies a little more assurance to enter these types of agreements. But the logistical challenges are very real. How do you follow these patients for 5-10 years? They might no longer be on Medicaid. Maybe they age out. Maybe, they're able to work and so they're off Medicaid. How do you follow them? What happens when they move to the other side of the country? I mean, there's just these logistical challenges that we haven't had to deal with yet. And I think that, working together, between the payers and the companies to try to figure that out, coming back to the federal government, there needs to be changes to things like anti-kickback statute to make that happen, trying to get this set up so that we can realize the promise of some of these products.
Okay, well, since you guys opened this can of worms, I wanted to go into a different type of payment issue, which is yesterday. This is ripped from the headlines. The Biden administration said sickle cell disease will be the first focus of its CGT, cell and gene therapy access model. And it's going to be run through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and it's a multi-state outcomes-based approach for providing coverage for cell and gene therapies. So, Jack, can you talk about your association's involvement with that and how you feel about this step?
Sure. So it's the timing of this conversation couldn't be better, and I guarantee we didn't plan it this way. It just happened to, we're just lucky. But NAMD did pull together a series of conversations between Medicaid, clinical and financial leaders and policy folks with CMMI as they were engaging in some of their work that resulted in this model. I think it was a really good example of state and federal collaboration to just hear so that CMMI could hear from the state perspective, kind of what are the issues that are challenging for you? What are the things that you would like to see a CMMI model speak to and solve for? Some of the big things that came up there was the work that goes into negotiating an outcomes-based arrangement, especially in a really complex and relatively nascent area, at least from the Medicaid perspective, of these types of products. And the question of scale, recognizing that no one state's probably going to be able to negotiate as effectively as a collection of states or the federal government. And so if there was an ability for states to kind of attach themselves to something that had been negotiated on their behalf and was offered to them, that would be attractive. The other element would be having to solve for the data collection and analysis issues. And many states just simply do not have the capacity to do that themselves. They would have to be partnering with universities or other types of organizations or contract that work out And that's never a guarantee with limited state budgets. So another function that could be potentially offloaded to the federal government. And I think you've seen, and if I don't know how many folks have had the chance to actually look at what CMMI announced yesterday because it came out yesterday afternoon, but you see a lot of these things reflected in what CMMI is proposing to do. Negotiating an outcomes-based agreement on behalf of states, states can kind of raise their hands and participate and join that agreement, but it's really going to be the locus within the federal government to negotiate it and to support some of those data elements. So I think a lot of the things that state leaders were worried about are spoken to there, which is very encouraging. I think it's going to be a good thing to test out and see, does this work?
Right. Remy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think
as we wrap up.
Sure. I think it's great that the Biden administration has sort of heard the call that access in Medicaid, especially as we have approved sickle products, is going to be a problem. This is an administration that has been highly skeptical of the drug industry, has been supportive of some pretty draconian price setting. And so to see them really acknowledge that there is a huge benefit to drugs that have sort of the 7-figure price tag, I think is a bit of a tide shift and something that we shouldn't sort of gloss over. I think it's a big moment. I think there's obviously operational questions on how this would work. Whenever you're negotiating with the government, those agreements are also going to include a price negotiation, which is obviously sort of a third rail in the industry. But I think that there is sort of a growing understanding that there's going to have to be some sort of back and forth. There's going to be questions about, can states have different sort of rebates on top of those, if a state has a little bit of variation with which the administration is allowing for. But I think, whether there's only 2 products that qualify, so we'll see how, those companies do and what those negotiations look like, yet to be seen. But I think if we can find some success, and obviously it's a model, so it can be tweaked over time, is something not working for the states, is something not working for the manufacturers. It is tough for these small manufacturers to go and negotiate with 50 different programs. That is difficult, especially if you're a smaller biotech that, this is sort of your sole product, which a lot of them are in the CGT and rare space. So I think we're excited to see what's going to happen here and really follow this over time as the logistical questions get answered.
Great. All right. Well, we have come to the end of the time for the second panel, and we're about to start Q&A. So if Lee and Wilson can come back up. If anyone has, there's a mic there in the back. If anyone here has a question. Oh, I see one here right in the front. And you should stand up when you, if you could stand up when you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Maisha from Inside Health Policy. So just because there was a conversation going about the CGT model, so it's from yesterday's announcement, it seems like states can sign up from January 2025. So I'm just speculating how states will handle sickle cell treatment. Meanwhile, like, is it through individual negotiations with the drug manufacturers?
I think you're going to see a variety of different approaches. And I think there are states that are already having some of those conversations directly with the manufacturers to try and get to some outcome-based arrangements. I think there will be states that will you might see probably some limited utilization, in part because of recognizing that there's a lot that will be going into the actual administration, successful kind of completion of a course of therapy for these products. And I think this is, Remy, I'll probably look to you to correct me if I'm wrong on these things, but my understanding is this is more of a kind of an inpatient environment.
Yes.
Yeah, that will require an extensive inpatient stay. For Medicaid populations, that will require a lot of wraparound supportive services, housing, transportation, kind of things of that nature that Medicaid is equipped to do in certain ways. But there's going to be, I think it's going to be a little bit of a glide path before we start seeing significant utilization, especially now that there is a recognition that there will be this potential option for participation in the CMMI model. So I anticipate that we're not going to necessarily see kind of skyrocketing utilization right out the gate.
But the interesting question, which gets back to some of the questions we had that we discussed in the previous panel, is there are centers of excellence that may have to actually do the transfection, that may have to actually deliver the drug, which may not be in every state. Mm-hmm. But some of the follow-up could be in many of those states. So when I talked to people at Boston Children's about this, when I was in the agency and even since, that's the complicating factor that I think the model will help resolve some of those issues.
And even the providers practicing, across state lines, having to register with those states' Medicaid programs to get reimbursed, the cost of traveling with a child or a sick loved one for that, 1 month hospital stay. There's, the CMS model does offer or sort of require a coverage of fertility treatments, which I know some of the manufacturers have been interested in for those patients, because the chemoablative therapy on the front end can cause infertility. And so having those wraparound services is also really critical, and something that, I think it's important to look at outside of the model as well.
I think it's wonderful that the government is doing this, to start to look at different models for payment, because cell and gene therapy, with their costs and with the expected additional approvals that we're going to see in years ahead, it's going to be a tremendous challenge. Now, in sickle cell, they're starting with an example where I think it's going to be feasible, perhaps, to do this. With many of the products that are going to come along in the future, they're going to be products to treat diseases that are slowly progressive, highly variable, and it's going to be very difficult to tell whether a patient is responding or not. And so starting with sickle cell is a good place to start.
Okay. All right, I see, oh, go ahead. If you could stand up, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Sarah Carlin-Smith with the Pink Sheet. I don't know if you saw, but this morning Biogen actually announced that it is basically dropping the marketing of Aduhelm, and it's not going to be completing the clinical trial that I believe was required as part of accelerated approval. I'm curious to get Lee's reaction to that, having gone through the process of figuring out how to cover it now and what that means for Medicare and patients moving forward.
Yeah, no, I did see it as I was coming in, and it is an interesting. I want to clarify something that Remy said about the surrogate outcomes. CMS very much recognized HIV and cancer. Mm-hmm. The question is, when is ctDNA going to be an acceptable surrogate from a scientific standpoint? And the key thing with the Aduhelm was the surrogate, as well as some of the endpoints, were not as clear. It hasn't shown, a delay, at least Aduhelm, when I had looked at it previously, of going into a nursing home, or some of the key questions. So I think the entire scientific community and the medical community, those of us who treat patients, are really looking for more information and clarity of whether those surrogates fit into the real pathway. Unlike genes, we know if you produce the protein, we know tumor burden. So I think it's interesting that Aduhelm stopped. One of the things that we kept hearing is it amyloid or is it tau reduction? And the different monoclonals have different effects on those two pathways to Alzheimer's. And I don't know if anyone saw it. There was just the article that there was transmission of Alzheimer's that was just reported, which confuses that pathway. So I think the comment you made about the variability of many of these diseases, Aduhelm may have not been the drug that had the greatest effects, but others may. And I think that's an important question.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's Aduhelm, and we had some colleagues commenting this morning that it'll be a chapter in the drug pricing textbook, in several years. I think it's a very interesting case study, and I think this sort of pulling off is sort of one piece of that. But I do think that I don't want to call it a controversy, the robust discussion around some of the coverage pieces of this. I think in theory, having these things in electronic medical records and being able to collect real-world data is fantastic. The health system for patients, especially when they're, they don't have great insurance and they're in rural settings, those things can just be really difficult. And so I do think that some of those challenges for patients and providers and having it be so burdensome probably scare a lot of patients away from using that therapy if they were thinking about that as an option for them. Whether we still don't know what causes Alzheimer's, which makes this tough, right? We don't really understand the pathway. And so I think that was my point with the cancer example is is there a tiny benefit? Maybe. Was there a tiny benefit to somebody? Maybe. And I think that some of the back and forth about payment can have a chilling effect as companies are looking to enter this space with new types of technology.
Just for clarity, you're not saying
No,
this in any way. CMS may not use payment as a criteria for making coverage decisions. And the way CMS is set up is the coverage group is under a career civil servant, has always been under a career, Patrick Conway and Kate Goodrich before me. It's always under the chief medical officer. And I can assure you that the decision to open the NCD did influence the potential effect on the CMS budget. But once the decision was made to open the NCD, no money, it does not enter into the equation. Is that the? Okay. Yeah, no, it does not. And that's why they've actually, there was a lot of discussion of where should the coverage group sit. And that's why benefit category is under Medicare, under the political, and coverage is always under a career.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll do an online question.
Good afternoon. I'm Rich Brennan. I'm with the ALS Association. I just wanted to say thank you all for your expertise in these areas in unlocking a lot of the issues that even the rare disease community is very concerned with. I think what I'd like to hear, if there's a way to summarize as far as the level of complexity that's going on in the space in order to protect access of these drugs as they make through the FDA approval and then go through coverage for evidence development or drug approval boards on the state side. There just seems to be a lot of players, and now CMMI getting into the into this side of things. If there's any recommendations, I don't know if this report addressed this, but the level of complexity in trying to get things uniform so that things, coverage decisions that are made for Medicare B, C, D, and Medicaid and everybody else, and how they're informative of those insurers that are outside those federal and state entities, how it sends messages to them as well. So appreciate any advice you have.
So the interesting thing, since you named A, B, C, and D, is particularly in Medicare Advantage, if there's a national coverage decision, then they have to follow it. So that's really one of the drivers, actually, of opening the NCD, as we also heard from the plans. I don't remember whether it was formal or informal about that clarity, so there isn't an access problem. I think that, and so the $10 million that was suggested of making that clarity. CMS, when I was there, and I know this is the administrator's belief, and I was just with a whole bunch of the ALS community in New York yesterday at the Coupa meeting. They were wonderful, and I think people should just go in and talk to them about the importance of that clarity ahead of time. We encourage drug companies, you said we should be separate, but coming and understanding some of the complexities. And I really do think that idea of the surrogate outcome that the entire scientific community says is valid really is one of the best, I think, recommendations out of the most important out of the report. Because if you have NIH and FDA and the scientific community all divergent, that's different than with cancer. There really is uniformity, just like in HIV and in, I think, even in the rare diseases of proteins, the protein from the gene product, much more uniformity of discussion.
I think it's going to be very difficult to get scientific consensus around these surrogate endpoints.
Okay, and we have a question from online. Keep them coming. Would an electronic or shared database work as a more formal mode of communication between CMS and FDA?
There's been one drug in which an NCD was actually opened besides CAR-T in recent years. How many drugs get approved a year?
It's like 70.
So I think that may be helpful, but I think it's really for FDA has an idea of where the controversies are, so I think that's the key point.
Okay. Anybody else here want to sneak one in? Sure. You need, right, they can.
So the BPC report says that CMS should share a like claims data with FDA. I just wanted, or is it,
It's
or did
already
I get?
done.
It's already done. So is it like, I just wanted to know that if, if like FDA is engaging in talks with CMS to come up with ways for FDA to gather more claims data, or it's.
I think that the recommendation of the report was that ARC should take a look at the claims data and then be able to feed that real world evidence back into FDA. So I think it's that second step was the suggestion, was to go through ARC. Not necessarily endorsing it, but just clarifying what that recommendation was.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I think we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank all of you so much for what was a fascinating and informative panel. And thanks to everybody in the audience as well.
Thank you.